On a sweltering July night in 2005, Maria Hernandez, a dedicated Mexican-American nurse, finished a long shift at Memorial Hermann Hospital and drove home. But she never made it. Her car was found abandoned. No signs of struggle, no body. Just an empty shell of her life, scattered like the unanswered prayers of a desperate family. For 18 long years, her husband, Carlos, and daughter, Isabella, held onto a sliver of hope, clinging to the idea that the truth would someday come to light. But what they uncovered in 2023 was beyond their darkest fears. The man they trusted more than anyone else was hiding a deadly secret. Who betrayed Maria? And why did someone so close to her family take her life? You won't believe the shocking truth that only came to light after nearly 2 decades. Stay with me, because this is a story that will make you question everything about trust, love, and the depths of betrayal. Keep watching. This is just the beginning. Maria was 39 years old, a loving wife, a devoted mother, and a pillar of strength in her community. Yet, just hours after leaving her hospital shift, she vanished without a trace. No calls, no texts, no messages. One moment, she was leaving the parking lot, waving goodbye to her coworkers, and the next? Gone. Her car abandoned. No signs of a struggle. No body. And no answers. For 18 years, Maria's family lived with the haunting question. Where did Maria go? Who could have taken her? And, most importantly, why? Carlos, her husband, still remembers the moment he realized she was missing. How he waited, the food growing cold, checking the clock over and over again, his heart sinking with every passing minute. By midnight, worry turned into panic. And with that panic came a gut-wrenching certainty. Maria was gone and something dark and sinister had happened. As the days and weeks dragged on, the investigation stalled. The police searched, but found nothing. The family was left in a fog of uncertainty, clinging to a shred of hope that somehow, someway, the truth would come to light. And so the years passed, but the truth was nowhere to be found. Until, in 2023, a new clue surfaced. One that would turn everything upside down and bring the search for Maria's killer back into the light. Before we dive deeper into the story, I want to know where you're watching from. Where are you listening to this heartbreaking case unfold? Let me know in the comments below. Stay with me as we uncover the truth about what really happened to Maria Hernandez and how her family found the answers they've been searching for. It was July 13, 2005, a hot and sticky Houston evening. Maria Hernandez, a dedicated nurse at Memorial Hermann Hospital, was wrapping up a long, exhausting 12-hour shift. Like so many nights before, she had cared for her patients with an unwavering commitment. She'd spent hours offering comfort, administering medications, and listening to the stories of those who needed it most. Her job was more than just a career. It was her calling. Around 11:30 p.m., Maria clocked out, gathered her things, and walked through the hospital's back exit. The night was still warm, the city's hum echoing through the streets as she made her way to the parking lot. Her car, a silver Toyota Corolla, sat under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from the hospital as the city of Houston continued on, unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. That was the last time anyone would see Maria Hernandez alive. Carlos, her husband, was at home waiting for her. He'd prepared a simple meal for the two of them, a small comfort after a long day of work. The clock ticked slowly as he waited, the silence growing more unsettling with each passing minute. Maria was late, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes, she had to stay later at the hospital for paperwork or final rounds. But tonight, something felt different. By midnight, Carlos's stomach churned with a growing unease. His wife was always punctual, always reliable. He called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again and then again. Nothing. It was becoming harder to ignore the sick feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. He kept calling, his anxiety building with each unanswered ring. Maria's absence was starting to feel like more than just a delay. His heart was pounding now, Carlos could feel the weight of the silence. No phone call, no text, no word from her. His mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Where could she be? What could have happened? At 1 a.m., Carlos could no longer stay in the dark. The dread had overtaken him, and he dialed 911. The operator answered with a calm voice that, for the moment, did little to soothe his panic. He reported that his wife, Maria Hernandez, was missing. After verifying the details, the operator assured him that officers would be dispatched, but Carlos felt helpless. His heart was sinking with the weight of uncertainty. He tried to stay calm, tried to trust that she'd come home, but the minutes turned into hours and the night dragged on. When the Houston Police Department arrived on the scene, they immediately began their investigation, but they didn't have much to go on. Maria's phone was off, and there were no signs of foul play. They searched the apartment complex and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of Maria. And then, just as the first glimmer of daylight began to touch the horizon, Carlos received a call that would send the case in a new direction. Her car had been found. It was abandoned on a quiet, secluded road in the city, miles away from where she should have been. But there were no signs of Maria. No blood, no broken glass, no struggle. The car was locked, as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Her purse, her belongings, and everything she needed to be safe had been left behind. It was as though Maria had vanished without a trace. For Carlos, the discovery of the car did little to provide answers. His heart was racing as he stood there, staring at the vehicle that once carried his wife home from work. It felt like the worst kind of déjà vu, like he was being teased with hope, only to have it ripped away. His head swirled with questions. Why was the car abandoned here? Why had Maria not come home? Had something happened to her? Had she been taken? For the community, the news of Maria's disappearance sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. She was a well-known, well-liked member of the Mexican-American community. She'd cared for countless people throughout her career, always going the extra mile for those in need. Her neighbors, friends, and co-workers were left with the same unsettling question. Where was Maria? How could she just vanish into thin air? The investigation continued, but the answers remained elusive. Police searched for weeks, but they found no further clues, no traces of Maria's whereabouts. The mystery deepened, and Carlos, though desperate, remained resolute. He kept the search alive, posting flyers, attending vigils, reaching out to anyone who might help. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the hope of finding Maria alive began to fade. And then, as the years passed, the case began to fade from public view. Media coverage slowed. The police could only offer empty reassurances. Maria's case was officially marked as a cold case, another name lost to the dark side of Houston's unrelenting streets. But for Carlos, there was no giving up. For him, Maria was more than a missing person. She was the love of his life, and he would never stop searching. Her memory, he vowed, would never be forgotten. But there would be something, one small glimmer of hope, that would reignite this long-forgotten search in ways no one could have ever predicted. Something was about to break open. Something that would bring the truth to the surface. Before I dive deeper into Maria's disappearance, I just want to take a moment to thank all my amazing subscribers for your continued support. These stories take time, effort, and a lot of research to bring to life. If this story has left you questioning everything, or if you've felt the tension in the air as much as I have, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep following along with us. Share this video with someone who still believes that justice will always prevail, no matter how long it takes. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when I drop more gripping stories like this one. As the hours stretched into days and days into weeks, the uncertainty surrounding Maria Hernandez's disappearance began to weigh heavily on everyone involved. The police, while doing their best, were faced with the same unsettling void of evidence. The car was found, yes, but what did that mean? No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. Just an empty vehicle, abandoned without explanation. And with no body, no trace of Maria, the case quickly became an enigma wrapped in an ocean of unanswered questions. At first, the investigation was a whirlwind of possibilities. Could it have been a tragic accident? Maybe Maria had suffered some kind of breakdown, lost control, and ended up in an unfortunate incident somewhere the police hadn't searched. But the more the investigators looked, the more they found that everything pointed to something else. Maria's car had been parked far from where she had been expected, and there were no signs of an accident on the route she would have taken. The possibility of foul play loomed larger with each passing hour. The police began to consider the idea of an abduction. But who could have taken Maria? Was this a random act of violence, or something more targeted? Had someone been watching her? The Houston police had no shortage of theories to follow, but each one seemed to lead to a dead end. Could it have been a kidnapping by criminal gangs? Was there someone out there who knew something about her, but didn't want to share? The theories piled up quickly, but the evidence remained frustratingly elusive. For weeks, Carlos stayed glued to the phone, making endless calls to the police. He drove around the city, staring at every street corner, hoping for some sign of his wife. He and Isabella printed flyers, handed them out at bus stops, posted them on telephone poles, anything to keep the memory of Maria alive. The community rallied around them, offering support and hope, but with each passing day, the reality of Maria's disappearance became harder to accept. Weeks turned into months, and while the search for Maria continued, it seemed to grow colder and colder. Investigators went over Maria's background, her work, her personal life. They spoke to everyone who might have had a clue, coworkers, friends, even neighbors, yet nothing concrete emerged. No one had seen anything unusual on the night she disappeared. No one knew who could have wanted to harm her. The investigation felt like a sinking ship, with every lead growing weaker than the last. Carlos couldn't understand it. Why had this happened to his family? Why was his wife, such a beloved and dedicated woman, suddenly swept from their lives without a trace? He knew Maria wouldn't have just left on her own. She had a family who loved her. They had a life together. It didn't make sense. But the longer the investigation dragged on, the less likely it seemed that anyone was going to uncover the truth. There was a deep, gnawing sense of helplessness. As the months slipped by, the police continued to gather statements, track down leads, and investigate any possible connection. But each theory eventually faded, and each lead ended in frustration. The leads about the criminal gangs seemed like the most promising, but they, too, hit a wall. As the case wore on, some detectives started to wonder if this was simply a case of an accidental disappearance, a tragic accident where the evidence was just too elusive to find. And so, as time went on, the case began to sink deeper into the city's forgotten files. The memory of Maria's disappearance faded from the news. The posters were torn down, the vigils stopped being held, and the community, in time, moved on with their lives. But not Carlos. Not Isabella. For them, the hole left by Maria's absence would never be filled. It was a wound that had been torn open, but never healed. The cold case file was eventually buried under layers of more recent, more urgent investigations. The police had no new evidence, and the family was left with nothing but silence. In the eyes of most, Maria Hernandez had become just another name on a list of missing persons, her story lost in a sea of cold cases. But for Carlos and Isabella, it was a cruel, unbearable reality. The investigation had turned cold, and their hope, once so strong, began to dim. But even as the case began to fade into the background of Houston's busy streets, something still flickered within Carlos and Isabella. Their faith in the system never wavered. Their belief that one day, somehow, someway, the truth would come to light kept them fighting, even when the world seemed to forget. And just when everything seemed like it might remain in the shadows forever, a chance discovery would shift everything. It would bring Maria's case back into the light. But what happened next would shake everything the Hernandez family thought they knew about the truth, and about the people they trusted the most. As the years passed and the case of Maria Hernandez faded into the distant shadows of forgotten files, hope seemed to have all but evaporated. But in 2023, an unexpected twist breathed new life into the case, a twist that no one could have anticipated. A volunteer dive team, Search and Recover TX, had built a reputation for revisiting cold cases, focusing on long-forgotten mysteries where traditional methods had failed. One such case was Maria's. The team had heard of her disappearance, and driven by the determination to give families the closure they deserved, they decided to take another look at the Buffalo Bayou, the area near where Maria's car had been found years ago. Using the latest sonar technology, they began scanning the murky depths of the bayou, hoping to find anything at all, that could give them the answers they had been searching for. 4 hours, the team carefully maneuvered the sonar equipment, sweeping the water with laser precision. The dark, swirling waters of the bayou held no promises, but their persistence never wavered. And then something changed. The sonar pinged. A shape appeared on the screen, faint at first, but unmistakable, a car. It was a car submerged deep under the murky water, just as Maria's car had been when it was last seen. But this wasn't just any car. This was the silver Toyota Corolla, the car Maria had been driving when she disappeared back in 2005. The sight of it, still intact after all these years, sent a shiver down the spine of every member of the team. They had found Maria's car, and with it, the chilling realization that everything they thought they knew about her disappearance might be wrong. The discovery of the car was just the beginning. The recovery process took time, as a crane was brought in to carefully lift the vehicle from its watery grave. It was eerie, the way the car emerged from the depths, still gleaming faintly under the dull light of the cloudy sky. The moment the car was hoisted from the water, it was clear this wasn't just an accident. There was something more here, something sinister. As the team opened the car's doors, a wave of unsettling emotions swept over everyone. The interior was damp, covered in thick layers of silt and mud, but it still held pieces of Maria's life. Among the debris was a nurse's badge. Maria's nurse's badge. The sight of it sent a ripple of disbelief through the investigators. It was a deeply personal item, unmistakably hers, sitting silently in the backseat of a car that had been submerged for nearly 2 decades. And then there were the shoes. Maria's shoes, one of them wedged under the front seat, still partially intact despite the passage of time. The objects told a tragic story, a story of someone who had been taken, who hadn't disappeared willingly, but had been forced into a horrific fate. But it wasn't just the items inside the car that raised questions. As the team continued to comb through the vehicle, they discovered something even more shocking, a faint trace of blood on the seatbelt. It wasn't Maria's blood, but it was unmistakably blood nonetheless. The realization hit hard. The blood wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't an accident. This was something far darker. The presence of blood suggested that Maria hadn't simply left her car and wandered off. The car hadn't just been abandoned. This was a staged crime scene, a deliberate attempt to cover up what had truly happened to her. The investigators immediately called in the Houston Police Department. DNA analysis would be needed to confirm the blood's origin, but the implications were clear. This was no simple case of a missing person. Maria had been taken. She had been murdered, and someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But that wasn't all. A deeper investigation into the DNA found on the seatbelt revealed something even more disturbing. The foreign DNA didn't belong to Maria. It was the DNA of someone else entirely. A person who had been in the car with her. The discovery of this DNA was a game changer. This wasn't just an isolated case of foul play. This was a murder, and it had been carefully orchestrated by someone who had been hiding in plain sight for all these years. The discovery of Maria's car, and the chilling evidence found within it, left investigators with more questions than answers. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? Who was the person whose DNA had been left on the seatbelt, and what was their connection to Maria? The discovery turned the case upside down. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was a murder, and someone had gone to extreme lengths to cover it up. The investigation had just taken a terrifying and unexpected turn. What began as a cold case, an unsolved mystery, was now brimming with new hope, but also new dangers. The answers Maria's family had waited so long for were within reach, but so were the dark truths that had been hidden for 18 years. Who could be responsible for Maria's death? And why had it taken so long for the truth to surface? The next chapter of this story would reveal a betrayal so deep that it would leave the Hernandez family, and the entire community, stunned beyond belief. The eerie silence that filled the air as Maria's car was pulled from the depths of Buffalo Bayou was only the beginning. What followed was a series of chilling discoveries that no one could have predicted. As the forensic team examined the vehicle, each item they found inside felt like a punch to the gut. The sight of Maria's belongings in the back seat, her shoes, her nurse's badge, was a stark reminder that she had been forced into something much darker than a mere disappearance. But it didn't stop there. As the team continued to dig through the debris, they made an even more horrifying discovery. Bone fragments. Pieces of human bone, broken and weathered by years of decay, but unmistakably human. They had been hidden in the backseat of Maria's car, locked away under layers of silt and water for nearly 2 decades. The realization hit like a tidal wave. These bone fragments. Was it Maria? Or was there something else? Could they belong to her? A deep, unsettling dread gripped the investigators. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was a murder. Maria wasn't coming home. And someone close to her, had gone to great lengths to ensure that. The car, which had been a symbol of hope for the Hernandez family, was now a crime scene. Every item, every detail that had been uncovered told a tragic story of a woman who had been taken against her will, subjected to horrors no one could have imagined. The foreign DNA found on the seatbelt only deepened the mystery. This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was calculated. This was personal. Maria's life had been stolen, and someone had ensured that the truth would stay hidden for years, until now. As the evidence piled up, the investigation took a dramatic shift. The questions that had once swirled around Maria's disappearance. Was it an accident? Was she a victim of some criminal organization? Now gave way to a much more sinister possibility. Someone close to Maria, someone who had been hiding in plain sight, had been involved in her death. But who? And why? The Hernandez family, reeling from the discovery of Maria's belongings and the bone fragments, now found themselves trapped between grief and anger. The pain of knowing their beloved Maria had been murdered was too much to bear, but they also couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that someone in their circle had played a role in her disappearance. How could this have happened? Who had betrayed their trust so utterly? The question lingered in the air, unanswered and heavy. The community, too, began to wonder. The people who had known Maria, the neighbors, the colleagues at Memorial Hermann Hospital, and the family friends, now began to look at each other differently. Who could have done this? Who in their midst had harbored such dark intentions? It was here, in the midst of this growing suspicion, that the first clue of betrayal emerged. The investigators, going over the details of Maria's life, began to examine her inner circle with a new critical eye. And what they found was nothing short of shocking. Maria's closest friend, a woman she had trusted with her deepest secrets, had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had grown distant, avoiding phone calls and making excuses for why she couldn't meet Maria. But it didn't stop there. There were whispers that hinted at something much more sinister. For Carlos and Isabella, the pain of the discovery was unimaginable. They had spent 18 years holding on to the belief that Maria would one day return, that the truth was out there waiting to be found. But the truth they uncovered was far worse than they could have ever anticipated. Carlos, a man who had dedicated his life to his family, sat in silence as he processed what had just been revealed. His mind raced. How had it come to this? How could someone so close to them, someone Maria had trusted, have been responsible for this? Every memory, every shared moment with his wife, now felt tainted. The man who had shared their dinner table, the friend who had offered comfort during their darkest moments, was now a key figure in the investigation. How had they not seen the signs? Isabella, now an adult, struggled to come to terms with the fact that her mother hadn't simply vanished. She hadn't been lost in some tragic accident or lured away by external forces. Maria had been taken, intentionally and brutally. The betrayal, the anger, and the grief she felt were all-consuming. She clung to the hope that justice would come, but the weight of the discovery was unbearable. As the investigation deepened, both Carlos and Isabella found themselves torn between seeking justice for Maria and grappling with the emotional toll of the truth. Each new revelation, each new piece of evidence, felt like another wound, but they knew they had no choice but to face it. Maria deserved justice, and they owed it to her to ensure that the truth, no matter how painful, would be brought into the light. But as they prepared for the next steps in the investigation, a new question loomed over them. Who could they trust now? Who, among the people they had let into their lives, could be the one who had turned their world upside down? The answer was closer than they had ever imagined, and the truth was waiting to break free from the lies that had kept it buried for so long. In the next chapter of this story, the investigation will take an unexpected turn. With new evidence in hand, the Hernandez family and the police would uncover a betrayal that would shake them to their core. And the truth, once hidden for so long, would finally come to light in a way no one could have predicted. In the years following Maria's disappearance, Carlos had clung to one steady, unwavering presence in his life: Miguel Torres. Miguel wasn't just a neighbor. He was a man who had woven himself into the fabric of the Hernandez family. From the very first days after Maria went missing, Miguel was there, offering comfort, helping Carlos shoulder the burden of their grief, and doing what he could to keep spirits high. He had been Carlos's confidant, his rock, a man who seemed to understand the pain all too well. For years, Carlos trusted him implicitly. But trust, as he would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing. Miguel Torres was more than just a family friend. He was a constant visitor at the Hernandez home. He had been there for birthdays, barbecues, and even the quiet, somber nights when Carlos just needed someone to talk to. Miguel was always there, comforting Isabella, joking with her, and helping with the day-to-day tasks that seemed too much for Carlos to handle. To the Hernandez family, Miguel was family, someone who would never let them down. But as the investigation into Maria's disappearance deepened, the picture that emerged was anything but comforting. Miguel Torres, the man who had seemingly been a lifeline, was now being eyed as a suspect. It started with small, subtle clues, details that Carlos had never noticed before, things that were too unsettling to ignore now that the investigation had reignited. The more investigators dug, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern. It became clear that Miguel's involvement in the Hernandez family's lives was more than just that of a concerned friend. As the investigation unraveled, it was revealed that Miguel had been obsessively watching Maria in the months leading up to her disappearance. Though he had always presented himself as a caring, helpful figure, there were moments, small, unsettling moments, that hinted at something darker. Neighbors began to come forward, recalling how Miguel would linger just a little too long when he visited the Hernandez home. He would often show up unexpectedly, sometimes late at night, offering help that Carlos hadn't even asked for. His attention toward Maria, though subtle, was unmistakable to those who had seen it. He was always near her, always looking for reasons to be in her presence. He'd help her with small chores, fix things around the house, and even insist on driving her to and from work when Carlos was unavailable. But it wasn't just the family that Miguel had been watching closely. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered something even more chilling. Miguel had been keeping tabs on Maria's personal life. He knew details about her schedule, her routines, things that weren't publicly available. At first, it seemed like he was just being a good friend, helping Carlos and Maria during a time of hardship. But with each new discovery, the suspicion grew. Had Miguel been too involved? Had he taken it too far? The breakthrough came when a former colleague of Maria's at Memorial Hermann Hospital came forward with a troubling confession. She recalled overhearing a conversation between Miguel and Maria several months before her disappearance. According to the colleague, Miguel had mentioned, almost in passing, that he couldn't stand the thought of Maria being with someone else, that he had always been in love with her. It was this revelation, combined with everything else the investigation had uncovered, that sent a cold shiver down Carlos's spine. Miguel had never been upfront about his feelings for Maria. To Carlos, Miguel was just a friend, a brother-in-arms in the battle of grief. But Maria, unknowingly, had become the object of his obsession, a fixation that had been growing quietly for years. The investigation now had a troubling new direction. Miguel Torres wasn't just a grieving friend. He was a man with a hidden obsession, one that had grown darker and more dangerous over time. As detectives continued to dig deeper, they uncovered more evidence pointing to Miguel's involvement. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras had shown Miguel's red truck following Maria's car on the night she disappeared. The chilling discovery of his DNA on Maria's seatbelt and the eerie remnants of his presence in her car now seemed more than just coincidence. Carlos couldn't believe it. The man who had been there for him in his darkest hours, the man he had shared his home with and trusted as a friend, was now the primary suspect in the murder of his wife. It was a betrayal so deep, so unfathomable, that Carlos's heart shattered all over again. How had he missed the signs? How could Miguel, a man who had been so kind, so understanding, turn out to be the one who had caused this devastation? The investigation now pointed to Miguel Torres as the man responsible for Maria's death. But the question remained, why? What had driven him to take such drastic, violent action? And how long had he been planning this betrayal, this act of murder, while pretending to be a friend to the family? As the investigation reached this critical juncture, the Hernandez family found themselves torn between disbelief and anger. They had trusted Miguel. Carlos had welcomed him into his home, his life, and even his heart. But now, the man who had been a source of comfort had become the very person who had torn their world apart. The shock of betrayal hit harder than any loss they had ever known, and now they would stop at nothing to uncover the truth about what had truly happened to Maria Hernandez. But the story didn't end here. The investigation into Miguel Torres's role in Maria's murder was just beginning, and as the pieces of this dark puzzle started to fall into place, the Hernandez family knew they would have to confront a painful reality. Sometimes, the people closest to you can harbor the darkest secrets. In the next chapter, the investigation would take an even darker turn, and the truth about Miguel's obsession would finally come to light. February 2023 marked the day that everything changed for the Hernandez family. After nearly 18 years of uncertainty, grief, and unrelenting pain, the moment they had waited for, hoped for, finally arrived. The man who had stood by their side through so many years of anguish, who had offered a shoulder to cry on and a hand to hold, was suddenly arrested. The weight of the truth was crushing, and the reality of what it meant hit them like a wave. Miguel Torres, the very man who had become like a brother to Carlos and a trusted figure in Isabella's life, was now in handcuffs. The man who had sat at their dinner table, shared holidays with them, and comforted them in their darkest hours was now the one accused of taking Maria's life. The arrest happened early one morning, when the police arrived at Miguel's home with the news that would send shockwaves through the community. News cameras stood poised outside his home, lights flashing, and reporters murmuring in disbelief as Miguel was led out of his modest, worn-down house in handcuffs. To the outside world, this was a man who had been a pillar of the neighborhood, someone people trusted, someone who had earned the reputation of being a reliable and friendly figure. But in that moment, everything changed. The facade that Miguel had so carefully constructed crumbled before the eyes of the entire city. For Carlos, the moment the police knocked on his door to inform him of Miguel's arrest was surreal. His mind couldn't process the words he had just heard. The man he had called a friend, who had stood by him through the years of uncertainty, was the very person responsible for the murder of his wife. It was a gut-wrenching revelation that hit him like a sucker punch to the chest. How had it come to this? How had he been so blind to the truth, living in the shadow of someone who had orchestrated such a monstrous betrayal? As the investigation unfolded, the depth of Miguel's deception became even clearer. The emotional shock that Carlos and Isabella felt was palpable. The man they had welcomed into their lives had taken their family's happiness and shattered it. Their minds raced, trying to comprehend how Miguel had hidden his true nature for so long, how he had lived under their roof while secretly harboring dark intentions. And the most painful realization of all, the man they had trusted had betrayed them in the most devastating way imaginable. Miguel's arrest didn't just shatter their world, it left them reeling. They thought they knew him. They had invited him into their home, into their lives, and trusted him with their grief. Yet all along, he had been the very person who had caused their pain. The bitterness of that betrayal was almost too much to bear. But the arrest was only the beginning. The shocking revelations continued to unfold as Miguel was brought in for questioning. The police had gathered their evidence, but it was during his interrogation that the true horror of his involvement came to light. What seemed like a straightforward case of a neighbor's obsession turned out to be much darker than anyone could have imagined. During the interrogation, Miguel's calm exterior began to crack. At first, he remained composed, sticking to his story that he had no idea what happened to Maria. But the pressure began to build. Detectives had pieces of evidence they couldn't ignore. His DNA found on Maria's seatbelt, the disturbing pattern of his behavior leading up to her disappearance, and most chillingly, the discovery of the bone fragments and personal items inside Maria's car. There was no way out for him. The walls closed in. The breakthrough came when investigators presented Miguel with a new piece of evidence. A notebook found in his home, filled with disturbing notes about Maria. The entries were chilling, obsessive, possessive, and full of dark thoughts that painted a picture of a man consumed by an unhealthy fixation on her. One entry in particular stood out. It read, "If I can't have her, no one will." Miguel's demeanor changed as he saw the notebook. His calm facade faltered, and the weight of the truth began to sink in. For the first time, the detectives saw a glimpse of the real Miguel Torres. He wasn't the man he had pretended to be. He wasn't the trusted family friend. He was a man with a twisted obsession, someone who had been hiding his dark desires for years. Then came the final blow. The police had tracked down more evidence that directly linked him to the crime. Witnesses who had seen Miguel near Maria's car that night came forward, piecing together the timeline of events. Miguel's presence, combined with the evidence found in his possession, left little room for doubt. The man they had all trusted was the one who had taken Maria's life. For Carlos and Isabella, this was the moment when the full weight of the betrayal hit them. They had known Miguel as a man who had been there for them during the darkest times of their lives. But now, they had to face the heartbreaking reality that the person they had relied on was the one who had destroyed their family. Carlos sat in disbelief, unable to comprehend the extent of Miguel's actions. How had they not seen it? How had they let him in, only to have him tear their world apart? Isabella, too, struggled to process the pain. She had grown up with Miguel in their lives, and now the man she had once called a friend was the one responsible for her mother's death. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any loss she had ever experienced. Her grief, mixed with anger and confusion, was overwhelming. How could someone she had trusted so deeply be capable of such a monstrous act? As the interrogation continued, the truth became undeniable. Miguel Torres, the man who had spent years hiding in plain sight, was the one who had taken Maria Hernandez from her family. The question now was not only why he had done it, but how he had managed to conceal his dark obsession for so long. And for Carlos and Isabella, the path to justice was just beginning. In the next chapter, the courtroom would become the stage for the final confrontation. A battle for justice, a battle for Maria, and a battle to ensure that the truth would be heard by all. The trial of Miguel Torres was unlike any that the Hernandez family had ever imagined. What should have been a moment of justice was instead a brutal confrontation with the truth, a truth that had been buried for 18 long years. The courtroom was filled with the weight of their grief, their anger, and their relentless pursuit of justice for Maria. Carlos and Isabella sat in the front row, their eyes fixed on the man who had once been a trusted family friend, now sitting in the defendant's chair, his face hard, his eyes avoiding their gaze. This was the man who had helped Carlos cope with the pain of losing his wife, the man who had offered comfort in a time of unimaginable loss. And now, He was the one who had taken Maria from them. The very man who had been like family was the one responsible for her death. Carlos' heart was heavy, and his shoulders slumped as he looked at Miguel, trying to make sense of what had happened. He had spent years trying to keep hope alive, believing that one day the truth would come out. But now that the truth was here, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The man he had shared meals with, the man he had trusted with his family, was the one who had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. Isabella, too, struggled with the weight of the moment. As she sat next to her father, tears streaming down her face, she couldn't help but think of all the years of memories, good and bad, that had been tainted by the knowledge that Miguel was the one who had taken her mother's life. The man who had called her daughter, who had played the role of an uncle, was now the one who had stolen her mother's future from her. How could he have done it? How could he have looked them in the eye all these years, knowing the truth? Both Carlos and Isabella took the stand. Their voices trembled with emotion, their words shaking as they recounted their memories of Maria, their wife, their mother. Carlos spoke of the emptiness he had felt, sitting at the dinner table without his beloved wife. Isabella talked about growing up without a mother, about the years of wondering where she had gone, and the pain of never being able to say goodbye. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was not just about a murder. It was about a life lost, a family destroyed, and a community shaken to its core. And as the prosecution laid out their case, it became evident that Miguel had been hiding his true nature for far too long. The defense team tried to discredit the evidence. They painted Miguel as an innocent man, a victim of circumstances who had been wrongly accused. They tried to argue that his DNA on the seatbelt could have been there for some innocent reason, that it didn't prove anything. They tried to cast doubt on the key witness statements and suggest that the whole case was built on circumstantial evidence. But the prosecution was prepared. They presented the DNA evidence, undeniable proof that Miguel had been in Maria's car the night she disappeared. The traces of his DNA on the seatbelt, the items found in the car, and the witness testimonies from neighbors who had seen the red Ford pickup following Maria that night, all of it painted a clear picture. The car wasn't in the water by accident. Maria hadn't disappeared by choice. She had been murdered, and Miguel had played a central role in her death. The defense tried to play on the jury's emotions, attempting to humanize Miguel and paint him as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence was clear. There was no other explanation for what had happened. The prosecution had woven together a compelling narrative of betrayal, obsession, and murder, and every piece of evidence reinforced that story. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial neared its climax. Carlos and Isabella struggled to hold it together, their emotions threatening to spill over as they listened to the final arguments. They had waited so long for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt almost too much to bear. Carlos looked at Miguel one last time. He was no longer the man he had trusted. He was a monster who had taken everything from him. The anger, the grief, the betrayal, they all mingled in Carlos's heart, but there was also a quiet resolve. This was the moment they had been fighting for. This was the moment that Maria's life, and their own, would finally be vindicated. Isabella, too, felt the weight of the moment. She hadn't realized how much she needed this trial to happen until it was finally here. She had grown up with a hole in her heart, a hole that no one could fill. But now, as she looked at Miguel, she realized that this trial wasn't just about justice for her mother. It was about reclaiming her own sense of self. She couldn't change the past, but she could finally face the truth. And that truth would set her free. The courtroom was silent as the jury deliberated. The air was thick with anticipation. Would justice be served? Or would Miguel escape with his lies? The Hernandez family held their breath, knowing that the answer would soon come. As the minutes stretched on, everyone waited for the final word, an answer that would bring them all a step closer to peace, or shatter the fragile hope they had clung to for so long. The trial wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about finding closure. And after so many years of waiting, the Hernandez family was ready to finally have that truth delivered. The courtroom had been tense for weeks, and as the day finally arrived for the jury to announce its verdict, Every heart in the Hernandez family seemed to beat in unison with the ticking clock. They had waited so long, fought so hard, and endured so much. Yet, despite everything, the question remained. Would justice finally prevail? It was now a quiet, heavy silence that enveloped the room. Carlos and Isabella sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the jury as they deliberated. After months of testimony, emotional pain, and long-awaited revelations, they could only hold on to each other, waiting for the moment when their lives could either be defined by justice or further heartbreak. The defense team had done everything in their power to make Miguel appear as an innocent man, casting doubts and attempting to confuse the jurors. But the evidence was undeniable. There was no escaping the overwhelming proof: Miguel's DNA found on Maria's seatbelt, his obsessive behavior toward her, and the tragic unraveling of his betrayal, all pointed to one dark, undeniable conclusion. The minutes felt like hours. The weight of the Hernandez family's grief hung in the air like a cloud. But even through the fog of pain, there was a glimmer of hope. They had spent 18 years searching for this moment when the truth would come to light and justice would be served. When the doors to the courtroom opened and the jury returned with their decision, the world seemed to pause. Carlos' heart raced. Isabella's fingers gripped her father's hand so tightly, it felt like the only thing anchoring her in the storm of emotions surging through her. They had lived with the unbearable weight of not knowing, and now, in this moment, the truth was about to be laid bare. The judge's voice rang out, cutting through the stillness. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Miguel Torres, guilty of first-degree murder." For a moment, everything went still. The words hung in the air like a prayer answered after years of uncertainty. Carlos could feel his body trembling, but not from fear. No, this tremble came from relief, from the knowledge that after all these years, after all the pain and heartache, justice had finally been served. Isabella couldn't help herself. Tears of disbelief welled up in her eyes. She hadn't known how badly she needed this moment until it arrived. There was finally closure, the truth had been uncovered, but there was no joy in it, just the bittersweet sting of a mother's love lost forever. In the days that followed the trial, Carlos found himself standing in the same places he had stood for years, at Maria's shrine in their living room, silently praying. But now there was something different in the air, a sense of finality. The one thing that had been missing all those years, the truth, was now firmly planted in his heart. Isabella, for the first time in 18 years, felt the void inside her soften. No, it didn't go away, it never could, but it was filled with something new. She wasn't left with the uncertainty of wondering what happened to her mother anymore. She now had the answers, and though it was painful, it was also freeing. The verdict was just the beginning. The real twist, the deep cut that the Hernandez family would carry with them forever, was the realization of who Miguel truly was. The man who had sat at their dinner table, who had consoled Carlos in his darkest hours, had been the one responsible for Maria's death all along. The betrayal was not just from someone they didn't know. It came from someone who had wormed his way into their lives, someone who was so trusted, so close to them, that they had never once questioned his presence. And now, Carlos would never look at Miguel's empty chair without feeling the sharp sting of that betrayal. Isabella, too, was faced with a deep conflict. She had loved Miguel. He had been like a second father to her, guiding her through the pain of growing up without a mother. But now she was left to piece together the reality that the man she had trusted, the man who had made her feel safe, was the one who had taken her mother from her. Their grief didn't end with the verdict. No, it just took on a new form. The jury had convicted Miguel, but the emotional scars would last far beyond any verdict. Justice had been served, but the price was steep. Carlos knew that justice was important, but he also knew that justice alone would never bring Maria back. Her absence would forever cast a shadow over their lives, no matter how many years passed. Yet, despite that deep ache, there was something to be thankful for, something that gave him a glimmer of peace. Maria's story, once a mystery, was now one of truth, and that truth had brought justice, not just for her but for everyone who loved her. Isabella stood at the edge of Maria's grave, her hand resting gently on the cold stone. She whispered a prayer for her mother, for the years stolen from them, and for the future they would now have to face without her. She didn't know what to do with the anger that still raged inside her, or how to fill the hole that had been carved into her heart all those years ago. But she did know one thing. She would live her life in a way that honored Maria's memory. She would not forget. She would never forget. Now that we've reached the final chapter of this story, I want to thank all of you who've stuck with us through this entire emotional journey. These stories, as hard as they are to tell, are the reason this channel exists. And to keep bringing these important stories to light, I need your support. If you're moved by this case, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's make sure stories like Maria's don't get lost in the past. And remember to turn on that notification bell, so you'll never miss another shocking case when it drops. This journey isn't over, it's only just beginning. Before we go, let's reflect on this important part. Maria Hernandez was more than just a nurse. She was the heartbeat of her family. To her husband, Carlos, she was the constant, the one who held the pieces of their world together. To their daughter, Isabella, she was the one who tucked her into bed at night, the one who cheered the loudest at her soccer games, and the one whose warmth and care filled the house with a sense of safety and love. Maria wasn't just any mother or wife. She was a woman who gave everything she had to her family, to her patients, and to her community. A woman who never once turned away from anyone in need. She was that person who would show up in the middle of the night, selflessly answering the call of duty, no matter how exhausting her day had been. So, when she vanished on that night in 2005, it wasn't just the physical disappearance of a mother and wife. It was the shattering of a family's sense of security. Carlos wasn't just losing a wife. He was losing the very foundation of his world. Isabella wasn't just losing a mother. She was losing her best friend, the woman who knew her better than anyone else, the one who had always known what she needed, even before she said it. Maria wasn't just a person. They were everything to the ones who loved her. Can you imagine what it feels like, being left in the silence of a house that's just been shattered? To wait up for someone, to prepare dinner, to check the clock again and again, only for the realization to settle in. Something isn't right. Carlos's fear must have started small, like a whisper in the back of his mind. Maybe it was just a flat tire, maybe a delay, maybe she was stuck in traffic. But the minutes bled into hours. The minutes stretched into the longest night of his life. And when the phone calls went unanswered, the fear turned into something darker. The desperation, the panic. It must have clawed at him. He must have stood there in the living room, heart pounding, the cold sweat of anxiety soaking through his shirt, unsure of whether to hope or fear. At what point did he realize that this wasn't just a late-night inconvenience? At what point did he grasp the horrifying truth that Maria wasn't coming back? The worst part about this kind of pain, the kind of pain that comes when someone you love just disappears without warning, is the uncertainty. There's no closure. There's no explanation. It's not just grief. It's confusion, disbelief, and the heavy weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. For 18 years, Carlos and Isabella lived in the same haze of hope that their loved one would return. They held on to the idea that one day, somehow, Maria would walk back through that door, that the person who loved them would come back to them. They lived in a space where the only thing worse than not knowing where Maria was the fear that maybe they would never know. And yet, for all of that time, there was always a small part of them that believed the truth would come out. They couldn't know how, they couldn't know when, but the belief that the truth would find its way to the surface was their lifeline. They held on to that thread of hope as the years passed, as they weathered birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays without the one person who had made their lives whole. That hope was the fuel that kept them going, the reason why they never stopped searching, never stopped fighting for the answers that seemed so out of reach. For nearly 2 decades, Maria's case sat cold, buried in a drawer like so many other missing persons cases in Houston. But what did that really mean? What does it mean when a case goes cold? It means that the search for answers is over. It means that the police have no leads, no suspects, and no reason to keep digging. It means that those who loved Maria are left alone, abandoned to their grief, while life goes on for everyone else. But the pain never fades. The emptiness, the constant wondering, it remains. There's no escaping the unanswered questions. There's no closing the chapter when the book is missing 100 pages. And yet, despite all of that, Carlos and Isabella did not give up. They refused to be forgotten. They kept Maria's memory alive. Carlos, despite the unbearable weight of his own grief, became the warrior, the one who would never let her name be erased. He attended vigils, printed flyers, and kept the story of his wife's disappearance alive in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would have the information they needed to solve this. Isabella, a little girl at the time of her mother's disappearance, grew up without the one person she needed the most. But she carried her mother's memory with her, and like her father, she refused to give up. She continued to live with the hole in her heart, the one that would never quite heal. But still, there was always that glimmer of hope. That hope that the truth was out there. That hope that the answers they so desperately sought would finally come. And in 2023, after years of waiting, after years of silence, something miraculous happened. A group of volunteer divers, the Search and Recover TX team, decided to revisit Buffalo Bayou with sonar technology. Why? Because they had heard about Maria's case, and they believed it was worth investigating. They believed, just like Carlos and Isabella, that Maria deserved answers. They believed that the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. When they found Maria's car submerged in the water, untouched for 18 years, it must have felt like a dream. It must have felt like a sign that the universe was finally giving them a chance to make things right. But when they pulled the car from the water, what they found inside was more than just an abandoned vehicle. They found the items that Maria had left behind. Her nurse's badge. Her shoes. The physical traces of a woman who had once been loved, once been cherished. But then, they found something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. They found bone fragments. And they found DNA. DNA that didn't belong to Maria. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a staged crime scene. Someone had deliberately hidden Maria, and for 18 years, they had gotten away with it. The discovery of Maria's car was just the beginning. It was the spark that reignited the investigation, but it was also the beginning of a dark and twisted journey that would take Carlos and Isabella down a path they never imagined. A path that would lead them to someone they had trusted. Someone who had been by their side for all those years. Someone who was hiding a dark secret that no one had ever suspected. Someone who had betrayed them in the most unimaginable way. And when they learned who that person was, the truth would devastate them. It would break their hearts all over again. Because the person who had been helping Carlos cope with the loss of his wife was the very person responsible for her death. Miguel Torres. A man they had known, a man they had trusted. Miguel Torres, a family friend who had been by their side in the most difficult moments. Miguel Torres, the man who had eaten dinner with them, who had sat at their table, and who had comforted them in their grief. But beneath that friendly exterior, Miguel was hiding a dangerous obsession. And that obsession had driven him to do the unthinkable. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? The person you trust the most, the person you rely on in your darkest hours, being the very person who destroys everything you hold dear. But that's the cruel reality of betrayal. And that's what Maria's family had to face when the truth came to light. The discovery of Maria's body was painful enough. But the betrayal that followed, the realization that someone so close to them was responsible for her death, it was a wound that no amount of time could ever heal. The truth may have come to light, but for Carlos and Isabella, the pain of that truth would stay with them forever. As the investigation deepened, as the evidence piled up, it became clear that Miguel Torres was the one responsible for Maria's death. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The motive. It was a twisted obsession, one that had festered over the years, hidden behind a facade of friendship and kindness. The man who had once sat at their table, who had shared their laughter and their tears, was the one who had taken Maria's life. The arrest of Miguel Torres in February 2023 sent shockwaves through the Hernandez family. Carlos and Isabella were devastated. not just by the loss of Maria, but by the betrayal of someone they had trusted with their grief. The emotional toll was unbearable, but they had no choice but to face the truth. In the end, justice was served. But the cost was high. The damage had already been done. And even though the family finally had the answers they had been searching for, the emptiness left by Maria's absence would never be filled. The pain of betrayal would linger for the rest of their lives. Maria Hernandez's story didn't end with a mystery. It didn't end with unanswered questions. It ended with the truth being revealed, though that truth brought more pain than anyone could have imagined. It's a story of trust, betrayal, and the strength of a family that never gave up. It's a story that will stay with you, a reminder that sometimes the truth can be more painful than the lies we tell ourselves. But as long as Maria's family remembers her, as long as they continue to honor her memory, justice will never be denied, even if it takes 18 years to find the truth. Before we close, I want to thank you once again for being part of this emotional journey with us. If Maria's story moved you, then you're going to want to see what's next. We've got plenty more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, gripping your heart until the very last word. So, after you're done here, don't forget to check out the other videos we've uncovered. Each one is filled with real-life mystery, heartbreaking twists, and justice you won't believe. Click on the next video and keep watching, because the truth is out there, and you don't want to miss the next shocking revelation. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.